Hello, Year 12, and welcome to our next lesson, looking into the race relations in Black British history. So today's lesson, we're going to be looking at the consequences of how all of the tensions that were building up across the 1960s and 70s in Britain sort of come to a head.
What we're looking at then is what were the consequences of continued alienation in the 1980s. So for this lesson, we're focusing mostly on the 1980s and the end of the 70s. So if we were thinking about the demonstrations that we've looked at so far in this inquiry, we've looked at different moments of Black resistance in Britain. So you can see here there are two images of the two different protests that we've looked at. So 1959 representing Kelso's murder, 1970 looking at what happened with the mangrove. And then here we have a picture of 1981. And this is another demonstration called the Black People's Day of Action. So how is this different to the previous demonstrations that you've seen?
The most obvious thing that we can see straight away is the amount of people that are taking part. Yeah, there's obviously a lot more people in the 1981 one.
Yeah, it's a very large scale demonstration.
So definitely it is a lot more large scale than the previous demonstrations we've seen. So I think the question is why is it so large scale? How is it different to the previous injustice that we've seen? Looking at this poster, which is supporting the Black People's Day of Action, what does this poster tell us about the motivation behind the protest? And does it leave you with any more questions?
I mean, from the tone of it, like, people are being a lot more assertive. They're actively standing up against this, like they're actively being anti-racist, and
there's various reasons as to why they're there and why they're standing up against. I mean, they've written out loads of reasons as to why you could go. So it's a very open and inclusive demonstration. So it's not just focused on police brutality, but like it says here, standing up against newspapers, radio and television.
I think the last line that says, "We will not let the police play around with our lives," like that is like such a powerful rhetoric that they're pushing. The fact that they're no longer going to stand for this, and they're taking matters into their own hands.
Seeing this source again just makes me think, gosh, that was almost 40 years ago, and that could literally be the same poster that could be used on a demonstration protest today, like stand up against the mass murder of Black people, stand up against attacks by white racists, stand up against the media, stand up against the police. It's like this, all the institutions that were still having these conversations about Black people, and anti-racists were demonstrating against that almost 40 years ago.
And I was just going to add how different those protests were. So if you think about in 1959, it was more the protest that was taking place. I don't know if you can just go back for a moment, Malcolm. Is that it's more about forming. It's telling people this is what's happening. Like there's murder in Notting Hill. This is taking place. And then in 1970, you can sort of see the anger that is boiling. And then by the time you're getting to 1981, it's more, there's a plan set out. It is saying, this is what we're aiming for. This is what we want to do. So even the tone of the protests have changed quite drastically as well over time, from informing to, I guess, anger to now quite decisive in what they want out of this. So I
think also the fact that, like, with the 1959 protests, they were mainly centered around the murder of one person. But now, like, there's too many people for it to just be centered around one person.
Yeah, because it said mass murder of Black people.
So one of the things that I saw that was pointed out in that poster as well is you've got this idea of the National Front. So it's standing up against the British movement, the National Front, and column 88. So 88 is in reference to neo-Nazis. So is the 8th letter in the alphabet. So 88 is HH, as in Heil Hitler. So it's like a reference to that. So it's a reference to the British fascist movement. And this goes back to looking at this event that happened called the Battle of Lewisham, and how does this affect race relations between the police and black people in Lewisham across London. So we're going to watch a short clip which talks about that, and the clip is going to give you the perspective of two people. So one of the people, so you can see the guy on the left there, is the person who is in charge of the operation for the police, and the person on the right is the person someone who attended the protest and is a local resident. And the other group that you're going to hear about is the National Front, and they are an extreme right-wing organization. So I guess the equivalent today would be like the EDL. Let's watch this clip and just think about how does this affect race relations. If you pause now, you can watch the clip and then restart this video recording so that you can listen to the conversation afterwards.
Wow. It's a bit terrifying.
It's clear that the police are sticking to a certain narrative, and that they're sticking to the sides of the National Front and the sides of the racists. And so, yeah, they're not with people of color.
And it's quite interesting that on the clip, the police leader said, they weren't doing anything wrong, like the National Front weren't. So even there is a legitimacy that is afforded to a racist position in Britain. Yes, they're not technically breaking actual constitutional laws, but it just shows that there's scope for racism to just live out on the streets freely with impunity, effectively. And so even though they were protecting them, even though the actual victims in this battle were the black people.
So that's kind of the actions of the police force then, which is one of the institutions of the state. But what else? How else are race relations affected? And we saw quite a long list of things in that leaflet that we saw before. So another area is the actual institutions of the government, so politicians. So at this time, Margaret Thatcher was actually an opposition leader. So the Battle of Lewisham was in 1977, which means that race becomes very much a political football, which is played around with. And in terms of the existing government, they're going to find it difficult to support these racist ideas because they're currently in office, and that was Labour. But now Margaret Thatcher is one of the key opposition leaders, and she gives a television interview about immigration in Britain. And we're going to listen to her saying that, and you can see there's an extract of it. So when listening to this person, Margaret Thatcher, who goes on to become Prime Minister, how might her message affect black communities in Britain, but also supporters of anti-immigration policies?
There was a committee which looked at it and said that if we went on as we are, then by the end of the century, there'd be 4 million people from the new Commonwealth or Pakistan here. Now that's an awful lot. And I think it means that people are really rather afraid that this country might be rather swamped by people with a different culture. And the British character has done so much for democracy, for law, and done so much throughout the world, that if there's any fear that it might be swamped, people are going to react and be rather hostile to those coming in.
So what do you think about that?
I mean, the language that she chose to use, she repeats the word swamped, and just the connotations of that word is really negative. A country swamped by immigrants, it's been taken over by immigrants. And I mean, the idea of a British character and that patriotism and that continuation of patriotism that's still seen today in politics. I mean, with schools having to teach British values, it's a bit crazy.
She's just feeding into that British nationalist kind of ideal. And yeah, it's just really nasty.
And she seems to be doing it in defense of people who don't like immigration. like she says, people are going to react and be rather hostile as if she's not that herself. And so she's kind of taken on the voice of their voice and voicing it in politics in a way.
Yeah. And if you think about the speech Rivers of Blood by Enoch Powell, all that sort of anti-immigration rhetoric feeds into all of this, and it creates a sense of hate. It heightens heightens hatred towards immigrants coming into the country. And once that happens, it becomes so much more easier to push these policies through, because you've created that basis for these policies, because there's that hate. And so you can see Thatcher doing the same thing here and creating that sort of bed of hostility so that it becomes easier to push these anti-immigration policies through and create that tension and that divide.
Yeah, and I mean, the fact that she's the leader of the opposition, leader of the Conservative Party, her upholding this anti-immigration rhetoric, then it becomes a consensus of the party, and so it appeals supporters of anti-immigration policies towards the Conservative Party. And I guess that could be one of the reasons why she does get elected.
I think even the fact that like she uses the word afraid, kind of just like it puts the far right at like in like a almost vulnerable position where they're pitied, and so their views kind of are more validated because they're in that vulnerable position. And because we have the gift of hindsight, we know that she gets elected, and we know that clearly the things that she's saying, like unfortunately a lot of the public agree with her, which is a really scary thing to see.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of the things that she goes on to say in that interview, which I thought was quite interesting, is she makes a comparison to the population of one town. And she essentially said that the immigration is so great that it's the equivalent of this entire town in Britain. And it really scared me listening to that, actually, because it's the exact same rhetoric that I heard Boris Johnson saying in regards to Brexit. And it's just this idea, like, you know, history rhymes. It's constantly doing the same thing again and again. And, you know, we're not really progressing as some people believe that we are.
Well, history, I would say maybe racism rhymes, but history doesn't have to. And I think, you know, there is a cause for, once we can recognize these patterns, we can start looking at uprooting them as well.
We're going to watch this clip here, which talks about what was considered to be one of the bleakest moments in a decade of alienation and bitterness. So year 12, if you pause this now and you watch the clip that we've given you on Google Drive, and then resume back for the discussion. So why was this considered to be a case of injustice, the New Cross fire in 1981?
I mean, many reasons. Like the fact that they immediately ruled out it being a like race related, so like they immediately ruled out it being
a hate crime.
Yeah, that they turned on one of the victims and treated her like a suspect and tried to enforce the typical narrative of it being like another black on black violence case. The fact that no one was held accountable, the fact that they weren't bothered enough to actually properly investigate, the fact that stuff like this still happens, like we were just saying, it reminds us a lot of Grenfell in the sense that like nothing tangible was done. Yeah.
So if you remember back to when they had the Black People's Day of Action, one of the things that they had actually spoken about was standing up to, I can't remember the phrase exactly, but standing up to the media and their betrayal in the media. And in this here, so this is basically an article that was printed in the New York Times, but it was printed in many various news outlets. But if you can see there, you have the reaction of people to a disaster that's taken place in Ireland, in which people died. And you have the Queen, you have the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, you have Ian Paisley, that are all sort of sending out their grievances. Whereas, do you think the same thing happened to those that died in New Cross? Do you think they were sort of, because why is it so important? So actually, why is it so important when you have people like the Queen and the Prime Minister making public condolences like this, or saying their condolences publicly?
I mean, it's a good way of showing that they're doing something. I mean, to have the Queen give her condolences, it's a way of kind of covering up and more of a superficial way of acknowledging what happened.
Yeah, we were just saying how it like also reminds us of another thing that's happened more recently with like the Notre Dame fire, and how as soon as the building was on fire, there were like billionaires worldwide rushing to give support, but then you've got like people dying in Sudan, in Yemen, in Palestine, like everywhere, and like no one blinks an eye. Blinks an eye, bats an eye, yeah. But it's just, yeah, sorry.
And even just tying in with what you were saying earlier about Grenfell, there was a lot of upset, if you remember, about how delayed the government was in reacting and making a public statement. So when officials are able to make these sort of public condolences and say, sorry to the families, it recognizes the issue. It recognizes it. It makes it a public tragedy. And you have the Queen that is recognizing something happened in Ireland, but as we come to find out, that they don't do that for what happens in New Cross. They don't make a public condolence. They don't make a public condolence. They don't recognize the incident that has happened, and they definitely don't recognize the race issue within this fire, within the New Cross fire that takes place. So you can imagine the tensions being heightened between not just now the Black people and the police, but you have Black people and the government and the media as well, because of what they're choosing to report on as well.
I was going to add that just when anyone's mourning after a tragedy or especially death, especially in lots of cultures, that acknowledgement of mourning with the person is almost part of the grieving process. So when someone passes away, you go to that person and you go and say sorry. You acknowledge that this is a pain, this is a grief that you're going through, and I see your pain. And I think that's a really crucial part of the grieving process in lots of cultures. And so whilst I think acknowledgement is really important, and we're seeing that now, right? Even when people acknowledging racism, doesn't undo racism, but it's a crucial part in undoing the silence around something is quite painful in itself. Not saying something, not acknowledging is quite painful.
Yeah, and I think it says it all in terms of how much Black Lives Matter in Britain. The fact that when you've got 13 young people as well, just the tragedy of the youth being killed here, and that no acknowledgement is put in place for them.
I was just going to add that this wasn't a one-off incident that takes place. They would put firebombs through letterboxes constantly. So when these young people were coming together, because obviously they weren't able to come together publicly, they would do it inside their home. This was a constant fear that they had of these firebombs being put through letterboxes. So this isn't an isolated incident.
So what you're going to do at home then is you're going to continue watching this clip about the Black People's Day of Action in 1981, and then you're going to look at these two sources and you're going to explain what caused the Black People's Day of Action protest in 1981. However, the story of injustice doesn't end there. And I think the New Cross fire represents an important moment of mobilization of the Black community in Britain. So what kind of happens next? And you have this picture here. This is actually a picture of Brixton. I don't know if you've ever been to Brixton, but this is a picture of Brixton. And what are your thoughts just looking at this picture? What's your initial reactions to it?
I mean, there's a lot of police.
What specifically about the police, or why is that a surprise?
Was it barricades? Is that the right term? It's almost as if they're protecting themselves against a coming threat.
Yeah. It reminds me of the Roman army. They used to have a similar strategy.
Very true.
And yeah, and I think that's a good word that you've used, the upcoming threat. So in terms of Brixton, what's significant about this happening in Brixton in South London? So who is the perceived threat?
Yes, Black people.
Yeah, so Brixton is and was a very black area. One of the reasons was when people arrived from the Caribbean, Brixton actually had temporary homes for them so that there was places for them to live, which is why it's still quite a Caribbean area. It's like a legacy of that.
As well, if you look at the people that are on the other side of the police, the civilians, how are they reacting to police presence?
I mean, it looks like they're just casually walking by and not paying much attention to it. So does that suggest that it's a recent occurring? Are they used to police standing like that in the middle of the street?
Yeah.
So this is part of something called Operation Swamp, which took place in 1981. And it arouses quite a violent and hostile response from the Black communities. So we're going to watch this 2-minute clip and just think, what was Operation Swamp and why was there such a hostile reaction to it? Okay, so what was Operation Swamp?
I mean, it was a series of stop and search on Black people, which just demonstrates that that need to control them, that need to ensure they're not a danger to society. And it's basically a police attack that's specifically and directly targeted at the Black community.
Hello, me again.
You alright?
Now I was saying that because I'm going to be in your room.
I was just going to say it reminded me of the rhetoric that Nixon pushed during his presidency of war and order and war and order or law and order. And yeah, kind of was justifying mass incarceration by criminalizing Black people.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
So it was part of his Southern strategy. So the South was very democratic. And so he wanted to get more Republican votes in the South. And so he pushed the rhetoric of law and order by criminalizing Black people and by saying that we're gonna fight the war on drugs and arrest all these Black people for taking crack cocaine and stuff, when in actual fact pure cocaine was mostly used by white people, but
it would raid more urban areas.
Yeah, they would raid more urban areas and arrest Black people for having crack cocaine so that he could get them off the streets, I guess.
Just building on from what Heaven saying is quite interesting, is because it's changing the language, so addressing a group of people without actually using the term. So, for example, as you said, in America, it was all of a sudden you couldn't say, the N-word and things of the sort. So how could you repress them? Well, you use terms like, we're stamping down on law and order. And it's the same here in England, where you saw Margaret Thatcher sort of saying, it's these immigrants taking over, and no longer is it okay to use that terminology. So you need to change your strategy. How are you going to address Black people without actually saying the term Black people? And like you said, you start using a different tactic, and these stop and searches become that, because no one's going to debate against the government trying to keep law and order. That's a given. That's their job. So you would have the support of many. So, yeah.
And then that period of mass incarceration just acted as the legacy of slavery, because, again, linking this back to America, but in the 13th Amendment, they abolished slavery, but then they said that it was no longer acceptable for a person to be treated as a slave except as a punishment for crime. And so by arresting Black people en masse, they just continued that cycle of slavery and oppression.
And if we're thinking about things like, they mentioned the sus laws there. So the sus laws was the indiscriminate stop and searching of people. So the only reason you would be justified in stopping and searching someone if they look suspicious. That's kind of what the sus laws were. And we saw in 4 days, they had stopped and searched over 900 people in Brixton. So why is that a powerful and violent tool used by the state against Black people in Britain?
Because police no longer have to justify why they're arresting people or why they're stopping and searching people, and so they can do it with impunity.
And what's wrong with being stopped and searched? Like, sometimes people say, oh, it's fine, you know, you're not doing anything wrong, it's not a problem. So why is it such an issue being stopped and searched?
I mean, you're already targeted by the police, and so you remain on their radar. And so just because they did it once doesn't mean they can't do it again.
Also, the fact that a lot of stop and searches don't end very well. In most cases, they can, like, minor situations can escalate very quickly.
Okay, so everything that you need to do will be on the Google Classroom for the rest of the tasks. And yeah, we look forward to reading your work. It's always really insightful and just really powerful. So we're really grateful for you for always putting in such strong effort.